the fatal flaw of No Child Left Behind was paying a lot of attention to the level at which students were performing at a specific point in time rather than the trajectory that they were on over time.
Welcome to Quality Matters, where we speak with experts across industries to see how their perspectives can inform our pursuit of high-quality education for all students. I'm Shaka, and this is Caitlin, and we're happy to be your guides for this limited series.
Like you, Shaka and I are passionate about all students having access to a great education, and quality is a driving force behind our work. But what does quality really mean? In an era where parents can customize their child's education, this question is more important than ever.
During each session, we'll hear from leaders in education, technology, business, sports, and the arts. We hope to apply their insights to our pursuit of a great education in the K-12 space.
Join us on this journey to secure a great education for all children. This is Quality Matters.
All right, Caitlin. Well, we are excited to have our next conversation with Dr. Marty West. Marty does a lot of things in the education space. He's an editor-in-chief at Education Next. He is the deputy director at Harvard Kennedy School, the public education
Program on Education Policy and Governance.
The PEPG.
That's right.
There
It's
you
the
go.
PEPG. He serves on lots of different boards, and really now over the arc of your career, Marty, you've seen lots of different ways to think about quality and to think about how we're best serving our kids. So we're really excited to have this conversation with you today.
It's great to be with you both.
Thanks for joining us.
I wonder if you might just give us a little bit of information about kind of what you think the current state of play is right now. We are recording at the Harvard Emerging School Models Conference. We're thinking about this new space. What are you seeing right now that's maybe enlivening you about how we're producing quality results for kids? I'd just love to get an overview of your thoughts.
Well, the pace of change over the last several years in the wake of the pandemic has been remarkable. Yeah. If you think back to the days when we were both studying and working on the issue of school choice in the early 2000s, it was sort of expanding bit by bit with different programs being passed at the state level, but all of them targeted in one way or another at very discrete populations. And we've seen this shift with more than a dozen states passing something akin to a universal private school choice program that obviously has created a huge amount of momentum. I think I've been very encouraged by some of the innovations we've seen that we'll be talking about at this conference, different models of schooling and sort of opportunities to allow families and educators to think about what school has to look like. At the same time, as I think back to those early days, I remember there was a lot of attention paid to, how is this affecting student learning in measurable ways, right? Yeah. That's what the research was about. We were studying what happens when you give a family a voucher or a scholarship to attend a private school, and we were looking hard at the measured results, usually as tracked by standardized tests. And that was really what the debate was all about. In fact, being able to say that vouchers or private school choice was a mechanism for educational improvement was really key to it being viewed constitutional and rather than simply as a strategy for advancing religion with public funds.
Sure.
And I feel like we've stepped back from that a little bit. I think there's less enthusiasm right now for systematically, objectively measuring student outcomes, and a little more of a tendency to see choice as a good in and of itself. And I think we may have an opportunity in the coming years to strike a better balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in thinking back to that time, and as you alluded to, Marty and I kind of came into the education policy space around the same time, and that's when No Child Left Behind, had recently passed, and so there was a whole lot of focus on standardized assessments. And lest people forget, prior to that law, we didn't have a lot of data. So in some ways, it was like a researcher's dream and a policymaker's dream because you had so much data, and you could say, well, how are kids doing? Now we're I think we're still asking the same question, how are kids doing? But the definitions and the inputs have broadened significantly, right? So now we're talking about how are kids doing, but how are they doing in terms of other outcomes, whether it's career and technical stuff, whether it's, development stuff, but non-academic measures.
I'm curious, you've got such an extensive background, so many different experiences. When you think of quality, and sort of how you just described the evolution of measuring different factors of it, what are some of those like gold star considerations for high quality schooling, high quality measurement systems? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, I think what I've spent the most time over the course of my career working with are standardized test results, usually focus on the most foundational subjects of math and reading, literacy and numeracy. And I think those do need to be a part of any quality measurement system in education. They clearly don't tell us everything that we want to know, but they do serve as a foundation. There's a risk that comes when you have one set of outcomes that you can measure well and others that are harder to get at or maybe less universal, that the measurable outcome can crowd out attention to the others. And I think that's something we've learned a lot about through the experience of No Child Left Behind, which places a lot of attention on those core indicators. So again, there's an opportunity and a need to strike a better balance. I think we've also learned about the need to use test results in nuanced ways, the most important of which, the fatal flaw of No Child Left Behind, was paying a lot of attention to the level at which students were performing at a specific point in time rather than the trajectory that they were on over time. And so I think that is an important shift and one that we need to keep in mind. And there have been opportunities, Shaka, as you mentioned, to start thinking about, we don't care about test scores in and of themselves. We care about them because they are a foundation for learning across other areas, but also because they tend to be predictive of the opportunities students will have for a choice-filled life as adults. Sometimes we can try and find other leading indicators of that, or even look directly at post-secondary outcomes as we're trying to evaluate high schools, for example. And I think that's been a positive development as well.
How do you think about the interplay between academic outcomes and parental satisfaction, parental experiences? That's something that Caitlin and I have heard a lot from folks that we've had on the show. They talk about, if they're in the education sector, they talk about parent satisfaction. If they're in other business areas, often they're talking about customer satisfaction, customer experience. How do you think about that, from your various with your various hats on?
Yeah, I think I have to think about that a little differently when I'm thinking about the highly regulated public sector, and then when I think about the private sector, and then the emerging sort of new private sector under new policies. I think in the context of the traditional public education system, where families are exercising choice mainly by virtue of where they live and then being assigned to schools, I think it's challenging to consider the decision to enroll your child or your expressed satisfaction about the school environment as a meaningful indicator of satisfaction, right? We know that there's a strong tendency once you're in a situation to sort of say, well, I guess I'm satisfied. I'm sending my child to that school. Sure. And you certainly can't take enrollment as an active indicator of sort of a preference. We know that a lot of people would like to be sending their child to another type of school if they had the opportunity to do so. So I think the real question becomes, and I'm all for surveying parents and trying to learn from that feedback in the traditional public school context. I just don't think it can sort of play the same role. I think the live question is parental choice an expression of satisfaction when parents are making an active, proactive decision to enroll their child in a private school? And is that decision, that expression of satisfaction, enough? And I, am very
choice, qua choice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm sympathetic to the argument that is an important indicator, but I think we need to be actively working to make sure that parents have the information they need to be really satisfied. I remember my kids attended traditional public schools in elementary school here in Newton, Massachusetts. I remember the summer after my oldest child's third grade year, first time he took the state test, that was the first time I had to actually get a sense of how he was progressing relative to the state's expectations, relative to what he would need to know and be able to do long term. And so that
relative
was
to peers even.
That was really important for me as a parent, even as someone who studies education, works in an education school. I really was in the dark until I had that data point. And I think we need to be finding ways to get parents those data points, even if they're enrolled in other types of schools.
I'm so happy that you talked about this and brought this up because obviously we talk a lot about quality. We talk about quality with lots of different people with many different school experiences. In this world of the emerging school models, less traditional schooling, there's a lot of emphasis on parents. When parents re-enroll their kids, that is the metric being used for satisfaction because they are executing their right to choose or exercising their right to choose. And so they are continuing to put their child back in. However, that is not a universal metric for assessing the quality of an educational institution because, like what you said, so many parents, they either don't have a choice, their child is going to the public school in their coded zip code, and it's failing, and they have to keep doing that because for whatever reason they don't have the information to know where to go elsewhere. And so I'm really appreciative that you drew the attention to, because sometimes I think the conversation does get outbalanced where parents are choosing this option, they're continuing to send their kids are continuing to show up, the enrollment has continued to sustain itself, therefore it must be people are happy with it, and that's not always the case. And on the flip side, sometimes that is a great indicator in the choice world, where if people are continuing to choose and exercise their choice to engage in a certain model, that is. So it's a very different.
Yeah, implicitly, a lot of the recent state policies have sort of endorsed that interpretation that parent choice is in and of itself an indicator of quality, right? They have done that by not requiring any measurement or tracking of results. That's made these innovations very difficult to study, I'll say, as a researcher. But I also worry a little bit about it. It also, I would say, has an unintended effect of leading states sometimes to require some other quality control mechanisms to be in place. So, for example, requiring a school to be open for a couple of years before they can take ESA money.
Right.
Well, that's a real constraint on supply of what you're trying to do is create new entrants. But several states have done that recently, I think, because they feel like they need to have some sort of quality control mechanism in place. So sometimes not being willing to bite the bullet and assess outcomes leads back into a world of input measurement, using inputs as a measure of quality. And, I think that would be a step backward rather than a step forward.
Are there state programs, thinking about the choice environment, that you would point to and say, all right, that particular state or that particular program is, if not perfection doesn't exist, but sort of approaching what you feel like is a good way to assess, quality outcomes for students?
So there are probably other people who are better positioned to speak to the ins and outs of specific programs. I will say I've always been intrigued by several of Florida's programs that require schools to, if they're accepting public dollars, to administer a nationally norm reference test and to report the results back to the state. I'd like to see more attention paid to how they share the results with parents. I don't think there's been much attention to that. And I'd like to see more transparency on the part of the state from what they're learning from collecting that data, which I haven't seen it been used actively. But I think that could be a good compromise, that we're requiring sort of one among a set of nationally normed tests that could give us give parents in particular a sense of how their child is faring.
Yeah, I mean, in Florida, as you mentioned, has now got 500,000 students participating in private choice programs. I think another 400,000 or so in charter schools. And one of the nice things is, because there is a lot of data collected, because students are taking some kind of nationally normed reference test, it means that you can do things like study some other outcomes, and you can look at competitive effects, and we don't have that ability in some other states.
Yeah, one looming challenge related to quality measurement, I serve on the National Assessment Governing Board, which oversees the nation's report card, our sort of one system for tracking student progress across states and over time. And it's been challenging to get enough private schools to agree to participate in that program for us to be able to really say we're speaking to the results of the nation as a whole. That's been sort of a headache in the background, but as states adopt these programs, if we see private school enrollment shares really increasing, that's going to be a challenge for our ability to measure quality of student learning nationwide.
Right.
And so we're actively working on how to make sure that private schools see it as in their own interest, even if they're in one of these small innovative schools, to participate.
Why do you think that they're not seeing, what would be their initial reservation?
Well, they're not required to participate. And so part of it could just be the burden of giving up a class period or two and interacting with the federal government. I think some of them may have misunderstandings about sort of how the results could be used, even though there are very strict prohibitions about our ability to report results at an individual school level or use it as a basis for any regulatory measures. But I think there are concerns in some segments of the private school sector about that. But I think we haven't done a good enough job of making it worthwhile for them and showing what they could learn. So even though we would never report results for a specific school in the NAEP reporting, there could be opportunities to give reports back to schools that help them sort of see how they're doing relative to a broader population.
Well, I talk about this a lot, and I think probably in another episode we've talked some about this, that assessments are a diagnostic tool, right? That they don't that it's not a moral judgment, right? It's not necessarily used to sort of cast aspersions on one school or on a whole sector, but you can really use it to improve the practices happening inside your building, right? And one of the ways that we've seen NAEP scores, I know in the past, I don't know if it's currently happening, you can speak to that maybe, but I know that a few years ago it was seen that the Catholic schools that participated in the NAEP assessment, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, as a sector did really well, and I think outperformed public schools. And I can see doing that. Like, we're going to have a really big blind spot, to your point, as more students participate in choice programs. But if they're not taking the NAEP, then we could be missing 15, 20, 25% of kids over time.
Yeah, Catholic schools have been generally strong performers on the NAEP program. They fared particularly well in relative terms over the course of the pandemic, probably because they were more likely to reopen for in-person instruction early. But we only know that because they are the one sector within the private school sector that pushes their schools to participate, and for which we have a high enough participation rate in order to characterize the performance of those schools as a set.
So when we first started this conversation, you talked about sort of the improvements, the trajectory, some of the advancements that have been made. And then in this last little brief discussion that we had, it was really interesting when you were sharing this idea or this notion that sometimes people don't want to participate in this, and whether it's because they're not sure of how it's going to be used, they don't want to give up the time. I was thinking, there's a lot that sounds sort of like this stuck mentality. Like, people, they're either not fully aware of the benefits that are going to come from engaging in some of this work. So hopefully you're still with me. My question is, we've had a lot of advancement. We've had a lot of new innovation. As we sort of think about this next step, conferences like this one, convenings where people are coming together, they're innovative, they're new, they're bringing researchers, they're bringing practitioners, they're bringing all sorts of people together. What type of advancements are you anticipating, or are you looking forward to in sort of this next phase?
So I mentioned earlier a potential compromise around states requiring one form of assessment, but not requiring exactly which one be used. Perhaps an even better alternative to that would be for private schools to voluntarily sort of develop those types of quality measurement systems, right? So for the private sector to step in and, whether it's an association or some other nonprofit entity sort of playing the role of becoming a clearinghouse for that type of information. I know as many of these schools start to use online learning management systems, there may be opportunities to innovate in sort of tracking learning in real time on a much more regular basis rather than via standardized tests. I'll admit, I don't know which of those ideas are going to prove feasible over time. Sure. And there's always a danger in education of having your desire to measure something well distorting what you actually want to be doing in the classroom, right? Yeah. Crude responses to test-based accountability is just one version of that. But if we start saying, we need kids to be working within this software package so that we can get a score for their reading skills, if that's not the best way for the child to be learning, we don't want that constraint to be distorting what educators do. So I think it's a space where we need a lot of innovation. I hope in the meantime we can actually, I'd like to see a little bit more of a push from the governments that are funding these programs to require some outcome measurement. I worry that if we don't move in that direction relatively soon, there may be a missed opportunity to really harness the innovation that we're seeing in the field right now on education delivery.
That's a good perspective.
Marty, we so appreciate that you've been with us today. I want to close with one more question. And as you think about, the changes that you've seen in education over your career, what has surprised you the most? And maybe that's as a researcher, maybe it's as a parent. I know that my perspective certainly has shifted and ebbs and flows as I'm working to educate my own kids and figure out what's best for them. What's really surprised you?
Well, I mentioned that, Shaka, when we first met in the early 2000s, what we were seeing was sort of the gradual adoption of targeted private school choice programs, usually by legislators rather than through referenda, where the issue often gets complicated for voters to evaluate. And I sort of expected that trend to continue. I think what has been surprising, I never saw the politics working out, frankly, for the types of universal programs we've seen in recent years. Something happened during the pandemic where all of a sudden it became more important to elected officials on the right. It used to be something where if a rural community wasn't interested in supporting this option, that would sort of be enough to trip up these proposals in state legislators. And that has really changed. And we're going to have the opportunity to learn a lot as a result of that over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, Shaka, another super interesting episode. This one with Marty West, who just had so much. It's so clear that he has such a broad scope of experience in the education world, but that he's also very focused in what he's sort of hoping to achieve, and he's got direction, which I really appreciated. As far as talking about the advancements we've made over the last, decade, 2-3 decades, and sort of where we're going. That was definitely a highlight of the conversation for me, was how it ended, and sort of hearing his take on what he's excited for and where he thinks people are headed. Before getting into that, and sort of highlighting a lot of what we talked about, this idea of measurement, he said something that was really interesting to me that I have continued to think about. He said some things we measure really well, some things we don't measure really well, and we have to be careful that when we focus too much on the things we measure well, we put this disproportionate amount of focus or pressure on that, almost to make it appear as if that's the most important thing.
Right.
And simply because we measure it well does not equate to the level of importance that specific item of being measured is. And so
well said.
I really think that's something that's not just applicable in the education world, but I thought about the conversation with Max Goldberg and Ricky Nix, like in the hospitality and the restaurant world. Just because you can measure something really well does not mean that that is the most, you can measure how many times people buy a dish, but you can't measure as well how many people leave feeling deeply grateful for the experience they had in your restaurant or with your, hospitality group.
Correct.
And arguably, how many times someone buys a dish versus how deeply moved they were by their experience they're not comparable.
Yeah, I think it was a great point. I'm glad that you got us kicked off there and started us here, because thinking about the restaurant context, like just because someone goes to a restaurant, like we can measure what they ate, we can measure how much it costs, the choice that they made vis-a-vis another choice. How do we measure whether or not they left the restaurant feeling full, satisfied?
Yeah, right.
Right,
Exactly.
that's much harder
Much more
to
difficult.
determine. Same thing, I think about what we measure with kids, and even in my own house, we've got the growth charts, right?
Yeah.
What are they? All it's doing is it's measuring height,
Right.
which is not nothing, but it's definitely not everything. We measure it because it's easy to measure, because you can stand up against the wall,
Right.
we can mark the line with a pencil, we can write the date next to it. What would be much harder to measure would be health, right? Overall health.
Yeah.
Well, that's a way more comprehensive thing, and so therefore, what do we do? Well, we just say, well, here's the height, here's the weight, etc.
Right.
In the education context, we often are asking these questions, and Marty's seen it, because he was there when No Child Left Behind was really coming, was passed, and then was being kind of enacted, and kind of states were breathing life into this. He saw the emphasis on assessments was helpful to measure what we could measure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't telling us a whole lot of things about other outcomes and
Right.
Mastery of other types of content. So again, I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Or
Definitely not.
that's my perspective.
Yeah.
Like, let's continue to measure some things, but we should also ask some thoughtful questions to see, are we measuring the right things?
Totally. So yeah, I second all of that. The other part of the conversation that I thought was really interesting, and I cued on this when he was discussing it, because this is something that we have had sort of a reoccurring theme of in our conversations. This idea of measuring quality of a program or quality of a school model based off of parents' engagement with that school model. And
Right.
so when you have these new emerging school models, and they're small and they're niche and they're chosen, they're actively pursued by parents, a great way of measuring the quality of the program is, do the parents choose to come back and send their kids the next year?
Right.
Or do they continue to send them during that year? No question, that is a really effective way to measure happiness, satisfaction, engagement, all of that with these new school models that have unique ways of being measured. However, that specific method of measuring parent satisfaction and engagement
in kind of the choice context.
Is absolutely not applicable in many of the public school
Right.
settings,
Right.
because you have kids and families who literally have no choice, either because they don't have the information they need to equip them with, or to empower them to make different choices,
Right.
or they actually are kind of
Literally
shackled
no
to
options.
the system.
Yep.
There are no options. And so you do see people saying, well, if you're going to use parent engagement and enrollment as a measure of quality and satisfaction in one world, look at these public schools. They have continuous engagement, they have continuous enrollment, and these parents are choosing to send it.
Yeah.
And it's just so inaccurate. And I really appreciated, the gist of this is, I appreciated he highlighted that and sort of drew out the differences between those two situations.
Something that he mentioned that I'd love to come back to. He sits on the governing board, the governor's board for that essentially administers the NAEP assessment, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, sometimes called America's Report Card. This is really the only place where we can get a standardized nationwide look at how kids in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade are doing.
Yeah.
the recent scores came out. 12th graders, it's some of the lowest performance in history in math and reading. I mean, really tragic stuff, right? Because it means I think something like 30% are on grade level, performing on grade level of 12th graders. Well, we're still graduating those kids and they're not ready for things.
Right.
But what Marty was talking about is the reluctance of a lot of non-public schools to participate in the NAEP. And I do think that's a missed opportunity.
I totally agree. And I've thought about that too, but yes.
Yeah, I think it's a missed opportunity for private schools. I mean, many Catholic schools do participate. And so I remember, I think when the scores came out 2 years ago, you showed that the Catholic schools as a sector way outperformed public school, their public school counterparts.
Yep.
So
okay. That makes sense.
That was pretty interesting. But you can only make that kind of comparison when you have the data.
Right.
And I think, but push me on this. I think that there's just reluctance by many private school leaders, whether those are, big schools, small schools, micro schools, whatever. I think there's some reluctance to get involved with anything that comes from the government.
100%.
Because they're worried about, hey, if we do this, it'll be the camel's nose under the tent. So maybe we ought to think about making it really clear when we're administering that test or inviting schools to participate. Hey, this is an optional thing. Data's not going to be shared at the school level.
Yeah.
But I just think it's a missed opportunity, because if I was a school leader at a private school, I think I would use it in my marketing materials to say, like, hey, guess what? Look at how good our students are doing at our school. I think that would be, again, an opportunity.
But if it's not marked school level and you're an independent school who performs really highly, but as a whole, the independent schools perform less, like you are raising the test scores and the other schools are lowering, then suddenly you have an attachment to a lower performance level than what you as an independent school. And obviously that situation is going to be few and far between. However, I wonder if that's a consideration people are having, like they have an inflated sense of how they might perform, and they're worried that if they start blending themselves or associating themselves with different scoring, lower than them, it's actually not going to be an opportunity to market themselves.
Maybe. I think that's super plausible. Maybe that's the case. I mean, listen,
maybe that's just pessimistic approach.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, I think it's plausible. You don't want other school results to speak for your school and for your students and your program. So, no, I think that's reasonable. Whatever the rationale is, though, I think it's a missed opportunity.
I agree, and I think it's a missed opportunity that might be able to be resolved with some extensive communication. Like I don't even say tailored communication, because I don't think there's any manipulating of the narrative. Like I just think the whole story needs to be communicated. No, it is not going to be broken down into actual schooling. And then these are the positives, these are the benefits. So no, I'm totally with you. I think it's a missed opportunity, and I think that what lies on the other side of actually having that data, in contrast to some of the statistics and the numbers we have now, would be really enlightening. It would certainly show the contrast that choice and opportunity that it might tell the story that we think we know.
Well, I think it would certainly give more color to kind of the outline that we all see, right? Which is that choices are improving students' academic outcomes, but let's have a really kind of detailed picture of that.
That's right.
I mean, I love what Marty said too. As a father, he said, I mean, he's a father. But this guy's a top-notch researcher. He's done a ton of writing. He's been deep in this space for, now more than 20 years.
Yeah.
And he said, I didn't really know how my kid was doing until third grade when he first took a state-administered assessment. And so part of this is just a transparency issue. I think parents need to know how their students are doing. Again, it's not because we want to be punitive either towards a student or towards the school, but just how are they doing? And why are we waiting until they're 9 or 10 years old to first track that, or in some cases not tracking at all? And so I think that the data transparency is nice when you're just trying to make those decisions for your kids.
Next, well, okay, to wrap us up and to sort of send us on our way, I would love to hear the audience's take on this opinion and perspective on assessments and testing, this sort of hot button issue that people have varying thoughts on. I would love to hear what people are thinking. And second, I think we should have a conversation with Marty West and somebody who we've had, I can think of a couple different people who might stand in opposition to this idea of assessments and
academic
the need
assessments
for them and the focus of them. Because I truly believe there is value in both perspectives, and striking the balance of using assessments and using them intentionally and appropriately is necessary. And how do we do that?
All right, so our next episode, we got to queue up an education policy cage match. Go. So it'll be like Royal Rumble for education folks. All right, well, we'll talk about that next. Thanks for this conversation.
Awesome. Take care, Shaka.
All right.